I'm delighted to say that we will shortly hear from Hester Wain, who is the Head of Patient Safety Policy at NHSEngland, and that's regarding patient safety work nationally and linking that into the clinical audit arena, both in response to patient safety issues and concerns, but also about further driving the really important agenda of using clinical audit to improve health and care. Then obviously we're quite excited to also let you know that we're going to announce and hear from the winner of the Patient Safety Clinical Audit Hero Award about their experiences of directly using clinical audit to support patient safety in preventing avoidable harm. So Sonia, if we can move to the next slide then, we'll just look at today's agenda in a little bit more detail. So we're going to touch on the importance of Clinical Audit Awareness Week to us, the clinical audit and the wider QI community, and what preventing avoidable harm means to all of us here with that common purpose of strengthening and making even better. Hester will speak with us all on the national agenda and thoughts for that local application before moving on to announce our clinical audit hero for patient safety. We'll then hear our clinical audit hero present their winning submission, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions on the theme patient safety. Please do post in the chat as we move through session. If we don't get a chance to answer all of your questions raised, we will collate a Q&A document post lunch and learn and try to publish those responses where we can. And before we close at 1:30, we'd like to ask you to join in with an interactive evaluation on screen. We do value your feedback, so I'd appreciate support to gather what worked well and what could be even better if. And Layla, our chair of the London Quality Improvement and Clinical Audit Network, will be walking us through those questions. We will be evaluating the lunch and learns and sharing their feedback at the 20th of September Open NQICAN meeting. And also we'll be asking our regional network chairs to collate feedback from their regional members on the impact of Clinical Audit Awareness Week in their own organisations. And then just quickly, one final note before we move on to the next slide is just to remind everybody, so we can keep in our minds as we go through this week, the recently published Delivery and Continuous Improvement Review from NHSEngland by Catherine Pereira, the Programme Director, where the NHS impact improving patient together was introduced. And that's about a new single shared NHS improvement approach, and we will hear more about that from Vin Dawakar, the Medical Director for Transformation at NHSEngland, at an event that will be held this Thursday afternoon, 3 till 4 p.m. If you've not yet booked, you can do so via Eventbrite, and we'll share that link with you in the chat. Please do take away some challenges today for yourself to take forward in your own organisation. So if we move to the next slide then, just want to recap for those of you that might be on the call that aren't yet familiar with NQICAN, that we've currently got 11 regional networks, we've got 2 officers, 2 non-officers, 3 co-opted members. If you're not yet a member of your regional network, please do get in contact with, and we'll direct you to your regional network chair. They're all involved in Clinical Audit Awareness Week this week, and you'll see them interacting with you across each day. NQICAN has got a common purpose and a forward plan, and all the regional networks are actively involved in this, and they provide a voice centrally into NQICAN from all types of health and social care organisations, and they take that voice back out to their networks from bodies such as NHSEngland, the Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership, NICE and Getting It Right First Time, and more. We hold open meetings held quarterly on Teams. It's free to access links that are shared. Next meeting will be held on the 29th of June at 10 a.m, where we'll hear from the CQC on their new inspection framework and what this means for clinical audit. We have a national network and sharing forum where you can join and interact with colleagues around the country. Again, if you're not yet a registered member, head on over to the link and request to join. Sonia will pop both links into the chat for you. And then more recently, we saw the launch of the National Learning and Knowledge Hub on the NHS Futures platform, with a focus around taking action on national clinical audit findings. And that's a community coming together to support one another to celebrate where we have achieved quality improvements for our local communities. We can provide examples and case studies of how we've made things even better, what's worked in organisations that could be considered in others. It is in its infancy and will evolve as we network and share, building that repository of resource for us all. So we'll pop the links in the chat for you to be able to request to join that platform as well. As always, we've got the 4 stages of clinical audit for improvement cycle up here, and that's about us always identifying these areas to improve, making sure we're measuring for that improvement, implementing actions for improvement, and then evaluating that impact that those improvements have made, with particular emphasis on equity and access and sustaining those improvements. And this week's topics are going to touch each day on all the drivers behind our programmes of clinical audit for improvement. HQIP have published a quality improvement magazine called Cornerstone. I don't know if you've all seen this. It's a new online free publication. It's designed to support us all with quality improvements and clinical audit back in our own health and care organisations. So head on over to the HQIP website, and we'll also try and pop the link into the chat for you for that magazine as well. And then finally, really, Clinical Audit Awareness Week is a week. It's a point in time where we do celebrate and shine a light on clinical audit, but it doesn't deflect from what we achieve every day. So it's not just about that week in time, but it's what we're all pledging to continue to achieve through year and move to that continuous improvement. We'd love to see our audit community making pledges for continuous improvement through year via the NHS Fab Changes initiative. We will try and get that link for you into the chat as well. Don't worry if you're missing these links, because we will make sure that they get circulated afterwards for you as well. So if we move on to the next slide, then I was just going to talk to you very briefly about where we challenged you in Clinical Audit Awareness Week 22 around patient safety. And we asked you to go back to your organisations and think about your clinical audit strategy aligning with patient safety. Do your programmes include topics that are in response to patient safety issues or concerns? And also, are your action plans taken forward with that focus on preventing avoidable harm? So we'd love to hear how you've got on in the last 12 months. So please do get posting in the chat as well. And then finally, if we move to the last slide before I hand over to our fabulous key speaker, just wanted to share with you some of the key points around patient safety that came out of the Menti last year during our Lunch and Learn. And it was very much around making sure that ensuring changes are embedded, processes are working and understood. We're identifying trends and themes. We are actually taking action on this clinical audit outcomes. We're involving patients, we're involving the right roles that are actually doing the doing on the ground. And we're monitoring the impact of those action plans for improvements. We even had one suggestion here of use what matters to you to set those audit standards to make sure we're measuring what's really important to our patients and service users. And then just one final thought from me then, before we hand over to Hester to talk to you really. It's about taking action where we're evidencing that we're not compliant. That 95% compliant, what's the risk for those 5%? It's about not accepting being national average. Don't accept that achieved compliance is enough, because that's not what clinical audit's about. It's all about always striving to improve all the time and aiming to ensure that every patient, every time, gets the evidence-based health and care that's right for them at that point in time. So we'll move on to the next slide now. I'm going to promptly hand over to Hester Wain, who's Head of Patient Safety Policy at NHSEngland, and over to you, Hester.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Can I just check you're going to do the slides for me, or am I doing the slides?
Yes, Sonia's sharing the slides for you, Hester, if you're happy with that. You just need to push the prompt to move on. I just
wanted to double check. Thank you. Fabulous. So can we have the next slide, please? Brilliant. So here today specifically to talk about the patient safety strategy and how that links with clinical audit. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. So I'm very excited to talk to you all. Clinical audit at one point in my dim and distant governance past used to be a part and parcel of what I did. So it's very exciting to be able to share some of what we're doing nationally with you today. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the NHS Patient Safety Strategy came into being in 2019, so that's a few years ago now, and we have two key foundations that underpin that. So one is around a patient safety culture, and the other is about patient safety systems that support us in that. And you can see there, even just thinking about it, that the culture is around engaging, visible leadership, promoting openness, and some of that is absolutely what is fundamental to clinical audit as well. And then those safety systems that underpin, we're talking about governance, accountability, and understanding and beginning to bring together the whole process. Again, something that's very embedded within clinical audit. And then we have our three key aims, so the 3 I's: insights, involvement, and improvement. This is where we really focus our effort on patient safety, and particularly in the delivery of the strategy, and how we can really make sure we understand what's going on within the organisation. So that piece of insight, again, this is where clinical audit helps to bring together some of that information. Involving people, and by people I mean staff and patients and public and families and carers and all of those people fundamentally in a real co-production approach, and then ultimately improving, which, let's face it, is quite fundamental to clinical audit as well as patient safety. So how can we improve, and how do we know we've improved, and how do we know we're moving forwards with that? So that sort of sustainability perspective. So next slide, please. So, 2019, well, what have we actually done? So yes, we have achieved a few things since then. So we have that first ever patient safety strategy across NHSEngland. We have a variety of patient safety collaboratives and other improvement programs that have been ongoing since then. We've had the first ever organisations that have actually been rated CQC outstanding for safety. So that's quite a change from where we've been previously. We have launched the new incident reporting system, so Learn from Patient Safety Events, LFPSE. So that's been launched, and the idea there is that all of the systems will move across to that by September this year. In line and alongside that, we've launched PSERF, the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework. So this is a replacement for the Serious Incident Framework. And with that replacement, it's about looking at how to do things completely differently. So it's a very, very new way, a novel way of looking at things, and actually really starts to make a shift in the culture, because you have to shift your culture to be able to shift to this new way of looking at things. We've published the first patient safety syllabus, and from that we have training modules that are available to all. They're online, they're free, it takes around an hour, and you can all go and do those first 2 modules that are available. They may well also be part of your ESR, your electronic staff record now, so you might be able to do them that way, or through the e-learning for health platform. We published the first framework for involving patient partners. We've now have over 800 patient safety specialists. We have new style patient safety alerts based on audit feedback about how we can make these things work better. We've started to roll out medical examiners. We now have a cross arm's length body patient safety committee, so NHSEngland and others, for example, CQC. And we're working on the inequalities and experience of harm. And we've then also put in place, there's a new digital clinical safety strategy, the primary care safety plan coming into place, and a new maternity transformation programme. Next slide, please. So how on earth does this all actually link to clinical audit? Well, so patient safety culture and systems, we have a big piece on inequalities, and that links directly to NCPOD. I'm going to be going into all of these in more details. With our insight, particularly clinical audit fits into that patient safety incident response framework and the plans from that. Involvement, patient safety partners and specialists, absolutely part and parcel with how do those particular people become more and more involved in clinical audit, and where does the feedback come in there? And then from improvement, the programs that we have. Next slide, please. So we've spent some considerable time having lots of conversations about what do we mean by patient safety health inequalities. So we have a definition there of healthcare inequalities, which has been out for a little while, and we understand that. And then we were thinking, so when we look at this, what do we really mean? So we've co-created this definition with our patient safety specialists, our patient safety partners, and those with lived experience and expertise in different areas of inequalities and protected characteristics. So we're really thinking about understanding that inequality with unequal access and experience, and it's all to do with how that relates to the risk of somebody having harm happen to them, and what can we do to reduce those inequalities that maybe increase that risk, and how do we understand it? And this is really quite new work. There isn't much in the way of research published on this, but what we do have is we have a few little nuggets from clinical audit. So next slide, please. So if we're thinking about the 9 protected characteristics, and if you're not 100% up with them, they're all there on the left. So we're thinking about those, and actually we start to look at those and we realise that we understand from clinical audit in particular why some of these actually are inequalities and why inequalities are there and what they are. So particularly if we're thinking about the Embrace audit, we now much more understand that Black women are 3.7 times more likely to die than white women. That's a horrendous statistic. Asian women are 1.8 times more likely to die in childbirth. So this is really important. Now we know the data that tells us what's happening from clinical audit, then we can start to address the problems and try and unpick that, understand why, and then start to put improvements into place. But it's not just about race or religion or anything else. If we look here with trans and non-binary people, actually there's some real challenges there around people there who are pregnant and how that experience works for them and what that experience is. And we do know that patient experience is really important, because if we don't understand that patient experience, patients will then start withdrawing from our services and we won't be able to give them all the care that they need. So it's really important here. And I have another example there of particularly relating to Black children in child and adolescent mental health services, and actually whether you're referred by your GP or by another means, and actually why is that discrimination or discrepancy there. So again, trying to start to understand this by understanding the data. Next slide, please. So NCPOD, I don't even need to define that because I know you all know what it means. So NCPOD have been working really hard and they've done a most amazing piece of work. If you haven't seen this report on inequality that came out just last year, please go and have a look at it. They were really clear that actually, although we haven't been consistently collecting data on protected or other healthcare inequality characteristics, that actually we can do some work going back and understanding what is in there. Apologies, my phone is going in the background. And so thinking about understanding that and then beginning to piece together how we can change things for the future. So within that report, there's a story there that talks about a 39-year-old patient and actually how their holistic care wasn't addressed. And part and parcel of that was to do with that space around healthcare inequality specifically for them. There are lots of really brilliant people stories within this. And what we've done furthermore within patient safety inequalities is to take some of those stories, and particularly using ones from NCPOD. So I hope you can see here we've borrowed ideas from NCPOD, but actually it's about sharing that to and fro on patient safety. Next slide, please. So then focusing on the patient safety incident response framework. So this is a movement that's replacing the serious incident framework. This is a different way of thinking. It's a completely new and novel approach. It is not looking at investigating every incident that we find. It is looking at a wider response of improvement. So this fundamentally absolutely sits within that audit sphere. And it's really important from that place that we begin to understand what's going on and that all of this comes together in a much more holistic space of looking and understanding risk within an organisation. It's a really significant shift in safety culture, and part and parcel of doing this, it's taken a few years to get to the stage we're in now, but it's been a cycle of testing and revision and involving people within pilot schemes to be able to get to where we are now. Next slide, please. So PSERF should be in place within organisations initially from the autumn of this year, 2023. And in particular, there's a plan, there's a set of preparations. I've just borrowed this from the top section of the PSERV preparations document. And it's thinking about orientation, diagnostics, governance, planning, curation and agreement of the policy, and that transition across. So that's what we're looking at. And actually, where does audit fit in this? Well, again, audit is there, absolutely fundamentally embedded. So orientation, we're talking about internal stakeholders that will come from different parts of the organisation. And absolutely, audit sits smack bang in the middle of that, because within all of that audit, you've been gathering data together that actually we can use to look and understand what is the organisational risk from a PSERV perspective. Then we start to look at the diagnostic and governance, working with relevant partners. And again, thinking about ultimately determining how the quality of the incident response systems and outputs will be reviewed, i.e. will be audited. So again, there's a space there, and thinking about actually, is that then going to be part and parcel of local plans? And by there I'm talking about audit programs in particular, and then planning, looking at that organisational data covering the last couple of years. So some of that is about looking at incidents that are recorded, for example, but it's also about looking at case note reviews, something that fundamentally happens very obviously within audit, and looking at those different systems that can feed in to look at that whole process and really understand where we can learn. Next slide, please. So moving from insight to involvement. So how do we involve patients in patient safety? There are two parts to this, an A and a B. So part A is all about enabling patients to be able to take control of their own patient safety in those places where they feel able and want to do that. So that's really understanding how that feeds in. And the second part of this is about really thinking about, in that sort of governance and policy and strategy set in place, about how we can use patients, and particularly patient safety partners, which should be in place in every organisation over this year. So you should have 2 or more patient safety partners in place in your organisation, and part and parcel of those being in place will actually be that they could well be part of patient safety audits. Could you just click, because I think there's a bit that's going to highlight if you do a click. I'm not quite sure whether it goes to the next slide or not. Oh, no, go back one then, sorry. So you can see there it says member of in that green box, and down there very specifically states patient safety audit. So again, audit comes in as part and parcel of this. Next slide, please. So patient safety specialists, we now have over 800 of these across NHS organisations, and they were set up in November 2020 and established not just in trusts, but also in independent providers, ICBs, regions, arm's length bodies, and there are some in primary care, though not many. And when we set those up, we were being really clear about, well, what do they do? What are they responsible for? Where does this go? So actually, we gave some really clear guidance on where these different things sat. And part and parcel of that is improving the quality of incident reporting. So there's something there to be taken forward and thought about in terms of clinical audit, and are there any audits in relation to that, and what has been done, and are there opportunities there? And this again may fit in alongside some of that PSERV work as well, and looking at it in the whole, but particularly thinking about where audit can help us to support patient safety going forwards. Next slide, please. And fundamentally, this is part of our continuous learning and improvement journey. I'm sure you've seen this learning pit slide. I've had a particular example of this for myself recently when trying to be part of a French healthcare organisation for a month, and boy, did I fall into the bottom of my learning pit. But anyhow, I struggled my way back out. So learning is there all the time for us. So really thinking quality improvement, it's fundamental. It sits within clinical audit, absolutely, and really recognising and sharing positive practice and achievements. Thinking about co-production, again, fundamental. So going back to those patient safety partners, where can we use them in our co-production processes? And then priority setting for improvements. Again, in a co-production space, how can we use people and enable them to help us to set the right sort of improvements? And also, how can we look at that in that wider system of the patient safety strategy? Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you an example of one of the improvement programs that we've been doing that has been really, really successful. And fundamentally, we wouldn't know we needed this if we didn't have clinical audit to tell us. So we know that people with chronic pain will take opioids, and they can well take them for longer than 3 months. And we know that that is detrimental. And we know all of this because of clinical audit. That has given us the data. So it's informed us of the problem. And then we've been looking for an improvement. And this is a national program that's gone out. So it's a nationwide solution. And it's about understanding that medication isn't the only way to manage persistent pain. And, you know, we now have patients who are 5 years medication free because they've been using, and this is their quote, skills, not pills. And how do they do that? It's about thinking about distracting or mindfulness techniques and exercise and movement. And that's how they've helped to manage the pain. And putting this improvement program out there that's gone out through the patient safety collaboratives, we now know that we've got nearly 20,000 fewer people with chronic pain taking opioids for longer than 3 months. That equates to about 2,000 fewer cases of moderate harm and nearly 303 lives saved. In fact, probably more than that now. So all of that work has gone to save lives. It's gone to create that space of safety for people, because we know that long-term opioid use is not good for people, and also ultimately it doesn't really help with their pain. Next slide, please. So my plea to all of you today is you can make a difference too. So I'd love you to start working closely with your patient safety specialist to add ideas to your internal clinical audit programs, particularly around patient safety and how you can support the strategy development. And also to start to think about capturing patient diversity data for all your clinical audits. I'm sure some of that's there already, but a real big push and a plea to really think about how can we understand the inequalities, and then we can start to address them. So next slide, please. So thank you very much for listening. In a world where you can be anything, I'd really impress on you to be kind, because you never quite know what's going on behind somebody else's mind. I'm going to do a few plugs here. So number one, it's Pride Month. Fantastic. Number two, kindness in healthcare. It's a social movement. It's brilliant. There's a conversation once a month on a Thursday, and it's all about kindness in healthcare. And interestingly enough, a whole bunch of clinical audit data has fed into some of that, and we have feedback from all sorts of people in it. But it's a really brilliant thing to do, and it's one of the high points of my month, because listening in that positive space is so much better for everybody. Right, that's the end of me for the moment. So I think there's another slide or two to come. Excellent. So I'm really excited to be able to announce the winner of the Clinical Audit Hero for Patient Safety. And in a minute, you're going to be hearing from them on their thing. I can see there's some questions in chat, and I will look at trying to answer those as the next speaker comes along, just so I'm not ignoring you. I absolutely promise it. So the announcement of the winner for the Clinical Audit Hero is Robert Oakley, Senior Pharmacist. Oh, I'm glad I talked a bit about pharmacy. That was quite useful. And talking about Vancomycin. So fantastic. Well done, Robert. And thank you very much. And I believe I'm now handing over to you to talk next.
Brilliant, Hester. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm very humbled to receive the awards. So thank you very much all for your consideration. So I'm just going to give a quick presentation now just about my experience of audits and quality improvements sort of arising from that, and how we've made a difference to our patients in our trust. And I hope this will be a useful case study for a lot of you to see sort of the different complexities of clinical audit and things you need to consider, and how you might be able to implement that into a quality improvement strategy. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background about vancomycin. So this is an antibiotic. We use it all over our trust, but it's mainly for gram-positive infections, so things like MRSA. And it's a first-line alternative, especially in patients who become septic. In our ICUs in particular, we use continuous infusion of vancomycin. So this involves a loading dose. So as you can see here by the infusions on the right, you get E and D. The loading dose goes through over usually 1 to 3 hours, and this is followed by a maintenance infusion. This is done over 24 hours. And there are multiple steps involved in this, which is, again, can lead to errors, which we'll go up to a second. essentially, we have daily monitoring tests to look at blood concentrations of vancomycin. And the significance of this is that if we get the levels too low, then patients usually get treatment failure. And if the levels in the blood are a little bit too high, it can cause kidney injury and ototoxicity. So it's quite high stakes for these patients. And next slide, please. So I initially noticed this during my clinical practice, and I thought, there's quite a lot of variability here that I feel that I'd quite like to investigate. So I actually was looking at doing a project as part of one of my clinical diplomas, and I looked at the HQIP model and was like, okay, this is a really good framework for how I can sort of set something up. And I spoke to our medication safety leads in pharmacy and also wider in the trust, which we'll go into in a second. But I want to just particularly focus on this slide because the framework of this underpins the whole sort of quality improvement and audit cycle, because you need to know sort of what stage you're at and sort of benchmark that with your progress, and also think about the interventions and planning for each one of those stages. And then when you're in looking at an audit cycle or quality improvements, you want to look at these sort of PDSA cycles, which you can see down here on the right. So key things are, what is it we're looking at and what are the markers that we can get to justify how well we're doing. And then what are we going to do once we've made the change? How are we going to monitor that, and how will it actually involve improving things? And next slide, please. So just to give any view of my experience of this. So as I mentioned, I was seeing a lot of subtherapeutic and super therapeutic patients treatments in my practice. So lots of patients' blood levels were going over the specified range, and there's a lot of patients under, and there's not as many patients as we'd like in the middle. And we were seeing quite a few adverse effects from this, which unfortunately led to prolonged stay for some of the patients. So I thought I really need to sort of try to benchmark this. I need to see if it's a problem elsewhere. So I went and did literature review, and I generally put some sort of wider searches into the literature about vancomycin dosing, and found that there was a huge amount of heterogeneity, both in the patient type and the setting, and then also the types of infusions and the doses people are using. And I was like, gosh, this is an absolute nightmare. But the literature review is really important because it helped me realize that this was a problem elsewhere and a solution still hadn't quite been found, which led to me able to develop something to actually benchmark how we were doing and look at the best practice, which I wouldn't have found out if I hadn't done the literature review. So then looked at stakeholders. And you can see here, we looked at who have increasing interest in this kind of project, and then also the influence to be able to actually implement a change. And you can sort of see here on the top right-hand corner, you've got our key types of stakeholders that I engage. So ITU consultants, particularly I was looking in adult critical care, but in whatever discipline, it's looking at the key clinicians who can be able to facilitate and potentially mentor you through this process. Also different members of the multidisciplinary team. So when vancomycin is given, you've got to think about who actually is involved in that. So a doctor writes prescription, the nurse then administers it, and then the pharmacist usually monitors or advises on the suitability of the therapy. And then there's also the patients involved as well, which I think a lot of people don't usually think about when they come to doing these sort of things. So based on this, I managed to reach out to a variety of different people that I'd identified, and we had a group meeting and decided that actually this was something we did need to look into. We were interested from a trust perspective in avoiding things like datexes, which is sort of patient safety issues we've encountered, which we had with this drug. And we went down the formal pathway involving the clinical governance and audits team. So we registered it as a project with the clinical governance team. And then this is also useful for continuity and being able to ensure the right guidance and everything is followed through with the appropriate teams once a change might be made. Next slide, please. So we initially did a benchmarking audit just sort of see how we were getting on. And this was developed between all the stakeholders that I mentioned. So we just wanted to see, the aim was, how well are we treating the patients? How many patients are getting the levels that we want, and how many patients are not getting the levels that we want? We benchmarked it against a standard, which was that 70% of patients were in therapeutic range by the second day of sampling. So sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. So in critical care, every 24 hours, we take a blood level. And by the second day, the drug's at what we call steady state. So it's more distributed in the tissue, which gives a better representation of how the patient is having concentrations in their body. And then we use this literature as the benchmark. And then we also looked at, other sorts of associations that might help us to improve the guideline. And methods, we looked at our trust prescribing data off our EPMA system, and we did, it was over a year, we actually collected the data, and we did a short pilot in cardiothoracic ICU just to see the appropriateness of the types of data that we were collecting. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this slide, this slide and a couple others will be a bit busy, but I'll just give the key points to you. So the first thing we found was that 71% of patients after 24 hours were subtherapeutic, which is not great. And then after 48 hours, we only had 29% of patients who were within range. This is what we're using to benchmark. So we've got 70% of patients who are not at the therapeutic standard, which is kind of the reverse of the benchmark standard that we picked. So we were like, okay, this is not ideal, but we actually need to look a bit closer to this. And the good thing about doing these audits is as a pilot audit, we collected lots of additional data outside of the aims I mentioned earlier. So we identified there were quite a lot of compliance issues. So we actually looked at 54 patients, but you can see here at the top of the left-hand side of this bar chart, only 38 patients' data was recorded. So the first thing was the data wasn't actually being recorded properly on the EPMA system. So that was a problem. And then the loading dose and the maintenance dose weren't being given, either the dose was incorrect or they weren't being given at the correct times. So then we come down to the right-hand figure here, and you can see only 17 patients out of those 54 actually had correctly protocol dosed vancomycin. And then when we look at this data, then we can start looking at the dosing aspect of things. So we realized that the problem was a lot more complicated than just the dosing issue, which is what identified in the literature search. There wasn't actually that much about the compliance, which we unveiled with this exercise. If you could just move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of implementing change, our overall aim was, we need to improve therapeutic treatment of this in the general ICU setting. And we chose the general ICU setting as a pilot because we didn't want to implement changes that we'd agreed across all the ICUs just in case, something was potentially problematic. We set specific SMART objectives, and this helped us identify the key components that we actually needed to target. So as I mentioned, the compliance and then the protocol dosing itself. And we actually wanted to do a 9-month period here where we would essentially implement some interventions that we thought about, and we wanted to get sufficient patient representation because this drug is something that you might get 5 or 10 patients on it in one ICU in 1 month, or you might get no one in the next month. So we needed to think about the timeline for collecting ample data. Next slide, please. So in terms of the methodology for the re-audit and beginning the quality improvement aspect side of things, we identified the identifying processes that every stakeholder was involved in to fully deconstruct the service. We then wanted to look at sort of identifying the problems within them by interviewing those participants. What sort of impact measures could we derive, and how could we actually derive change with stakeholders, involving everybody in actually trying to make the improvements. And then looking in terms of the plan interventions, how we're going to measure the metrics of success, and then how do we interpret them and evaluate the findings, and then continue any sort of benefits that we discovered. Next slide, please. So again, this is quite a busy slide, and I'm just highlighting here sort of the complexity that is involved here, because again, when I came into this, I had no idea of the complexity that every stakeholder had in the process. But in order to fully understand the issue, you've got to look at the problem in a much more multifaceted way, which is something I learned from this project. And we just found that actually for each stakeholder, so this is like the medical stakeholders, there were very many steps that were contributing to why things may not have been prescribed correctly. So one of them was calculating renal function correctly and not using the correct body weight. Another one was, making sure the infusion rate was correct, and some of the doctors weren't aware that we use standard bags for that instead of different concentrations, which then led on to a nursing error. So really understanding how different stakeholders work, what processes they use, and then evaluating where the problems are happening and how you can then implement a change to help them in that aspect. Next slide, please. And as you can see, this is the same one for the nursing process mapping. A key thing we found here was a lot of the junior nurses weren't aware, again, that we had different rates prescribed for certain bags. So if one of the doctors incorrectly prescribed, for example, 2 grams into a 500 ml bags, we use set bags of sort of about 100 mils with just 1 gram in. So again, you can see how the errors start popping up here. So there's some key identifications of both process and personal types of interventions that we can make. Next slide, please. So this led on to one of the driver diagrams that we created. The red writing is what we actually selected as within our stakeholder group. There's about 10 of us to actually implement. And I can't stress how important this was to get everyone's input and buy-in, because if everyone has to feel ownership in the project. And what I also forgot to mention earlier is we actually involved patients at the very beginning. So a couple of patients who'd been discharged, had been treated with vancomycin, who were willing to be approached. We said, you know, we've experienced this type of issue in hospital. Does this matter to you? What is important to you? And the patients identified to us that actually the length of stay and reducing any adverse effects was a priority to them. And that's how we actually determined the standards for our audit and quality improvement projects. And we then, it's really nice to have that feedback loop. And again, one of the other aspects of working with that team is you find out things that you might not have been aware of previously. So I wasn't aware that they had large rotations of staff in sort of February and July time on the unit. So once you get equal buy-in, there's motivation within the group. Everyone's working towards the same goal. And as a team, you can actually develop different interventions and then outcome measures that you can collaboratively work on to collect. And I think that's really important to actually sustain any interventions that you make. Next slide, please. So these are the key interventions that we made. So we made revisions to our protocol loading and maintenance dosing. So you can just see here the peak here, this is the loading dose. We increased this because based on our baseline audit, we identified that obese patients in particular weren't getting the levels that they needed. They were subtherapeutic, so we needed to increase the dose. And we did this by looking at other trust guidance and the primary literature. And then we also increased the maintenance dose for patients with good renal function. We also found that protocol accessibility was quite limited. So we introduced an app where both every member of the MDT could access the protocol, which is educational strategies for rotational staff coming into the unit. And we also did a systems-based intervention of an EPMA system integration. So essentially we uploaded the protocol to the system and made it much easier for every member of the MDT to work with the protocol within an embedded prescription. Next slide, please. So again, I'll just briefly go over this because I know we're quite limited for time, but it's just to highlight the types of measures based on the charts and the driver diagrams I mentioned earlier. And again, we were looking at key compliance measures and then key measures of how to get therapeutic concentrations. Also, key thing here is the balancing measures. So how were these interventions affecting the service? Were there more data reported for incorrect administration of vancomycin? So this is also useful to know just to see how this was it's affecting everyone else in the service and if we need to make any changes. Next slide, please. So again, I'll briefly go over this, but in terms of therapeutic outcome measure results, you can see here that we actually did make an improvement, but this is for all patients that prescribe vancomycin. So we got up to 54% of patients with therapeutic by the second level. So we've increased therapeutic administration and attainment by over 20%. But what I'll just show on the right is the run charts we actually used to monitor the service, and this helped us identify issues which we then developed a second PDSA cycle for. So we noticed that a lot of at the staff turnover periods, the first one we did at the beginning of the audit in October, we had brilliant educational strategy uptake, and it made a big difference to the compliance. However, in February, there was less representation by some of the nursing practicing educators, people were off sick. And we had, because of that, we actually found there's a huge dip in compliance, which then reflected on the therapeutic outcome measures. And next slide, please. Which you can, so just to demonstrate that, you can see that in the top right-hand corner here. But overall with the service, we managed to improve our both compliance and therapeutic containment of vancomycin. So that was, although we didn't quite meet the standard, which we actually found there was quite a lot of limitations because the patients in the primary literature are very specialized. They're not representation of the general type of public that you might meet on ITU units. We actually did exceedingly well. We reduced a lot of adverse events through kidney injury, and we're looking at a research strategy now to quantify how much length of stay we reduced. Next slide, please. So this is again just to very quickly highlight just looking at your runtime measures, looking at any feedback, and then planning cycles accordingly. And I think it's really important to have these continual reviews because you can see how your interventions are going and keep that stakeholder buy-in and make any changes to continue developing a proper strategy. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we managed to improve patient adverse events, we saved costs, we had multidisciplinary team engagement, which is now helping to sustain improvements. We had some data showing that we managed to get patients out of hospital quicker, and we reduced associated acute kidney injury. Next slide, please. And the last slide is just about sustaining improvement. So now we've rolled this intervention out to all ICUs, and we're looking, and luckily we're getting benefit across everywhere. But something, again, just to highlight with the system intervention monitoring, we've actually found, now we've launched this in a wider area, we've got other issues happening that didn't happen in our pilot. So we found that in some areas, both the nursing and medical teams, we've had some interface issues with our EPMA system, and it was about the standard bags we use. So we've actually identified that just by monitoring through certain markers that we'd all agreed. And that has helped us to improve sort of local practice. Every different unit is different, the practices are different, and the characteristics of interventions that you make will maybe have to specify and tailor to those individuals. And as a result of this research, this piece of audit work, we've now looked at research activities with the National Institute of Health Improvement. We're looking to get some economic analysis as well to show how we can make interventions and improve the actual data that underpins the dosing in the very first place. The next slide, please. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. There's a very great resource under here of the HQIT website if you want to access it, and very happy to take any questions.
Lovely, thank you, Robert. That was brilliant, and it obviously shows why you were the winner of this category. So we are going to move to questions. There was one. I'm just going to pull Sue's question out earlier. She was just asking how long the clinical audit took from start to finish. I know you put some timescales up on that slide, but approximately how many months was it, Robert, from starting to finish? From your second cycle?
So the second cycle was 9 months, and it's still ongoing, to be fair. So I would have said the whole process took us about 2 years. I think with more frequently prescribed drugs, this could have been done in a much quicker time. But again, I think it's just looking at your situational circumstances and then looking at an appropriate timeline and appropriate outcome measures specified to that. But also as well, in terms of actually implementing the change, we had to go through the medicines consideration committee, and that, again, they have 3 monthly meetings, so there are also other things you need to consider. It is a slow process, and it's keeping that momentum and engagement with your stakeholders is really key to that.
No, that's brilliant, thank you. I'm going to be scanning the chat as well for any questions, but has anybody got any questions? Do they want to raise their hands? And we've got this opportunity now for a few minutes to move to asking Robert whilst we've got him in the room.
I did see in the chat someone asked about support from my trust. So I actually did this as part of my clinical diploma, which is what some pharmacists can take as a sort of an additional sort of add-on to their skill set. But I actually approached, when I mentioned that first slide, the clinical audit team and the governance team. I didn't realise my trust actually had a quality improvement team, and involving them from the very beginning was very helpful because they helped me direct resources that weren't included in my diploma, for example, that I didn't know. And it made the implementation of any change and consideration by sort of clinical managers, and also from the economic analysis, like general managers, and looking at how that change can be implemented more widespread in the hospital. Getting that key engagement earlier is really key. And I think if, as I said, having that ownership from your trust in your project can really make a difference with how fast things can actually be implemented.
Brilliant, thank you. I did see a hand go up, but it's gone down, so it must have been put up in error there. So have we got any more questions for Robert, or any more for Hester while she's with us as well? If anybody can think of anything that, I know you've been busy answering the questions in the chat, Hester, so thank you for that. Oh, Colette's put a question here asking, what was the response from patients and what did they contribute to the study?
So when we approached patients, again, when they were sort of post-discharge, it was, speaking to patients' relatives, because in the ICU unit, it's quite a stressful place. So it's thinking about when it is appropriate to actually approach people. So in terms of the contribution, we generally asked patients to prioritize themes that are important to them. So in sort of friendly language said, you were treated with an antibiotic in a hospital. We're quite interested in trying to improve our processes with this. We would just like to know, for you as a patient, what are the most important things to you for your treatment with this antibiotic, given the background that there is some of this variability. And those priorities I mentioned were that reducing length of stay was really important to patients because they really didn't want to be in hospital. And also ensuring that there was no invasive procedures or painful procedures or adverse events. And I think it's quite easy to think from a healthcare professional, like, oh, patients must want this. But we actually found that having extra blood tests, so extra monitoring tests, and actually taking the blood, which can be an invasive procedure. Patients who are saying, actually, we really didn't want more of those, so if you can minimize that as much as possible, that'd be brilliant. And that translated into making sure we got the loading dose done correctly, because it's a bit like a bathtub. You want to get as much water in the bathtub to fill it up to the top, which is the loading dose, and then the maintenance dose is like keeping the tap on in the bathtub to keep the bath at level, and then the kidneys are like the plug in the bath, getting rid of the water. So when we actually managed to master that better, we then reduced the amount of interventional blood tests we had to do to look at how high the bath level was, if you see what I mean. So I think patients are the most important stakeholders. They might not be able to contribute process information as much, but in terms of key priorities and actually developing this further into research or any other area, they're, I think, your most valuable stakeholders.
Lovely, thank you. I think Amelia's just asked in the chat as well, as the result of the audit, have you changed, amended your antibiotics prescribing protocols?
Yes, so there was twofold amendments. So the first was, as we tried to say, it was mentioned earlier, every patient is different, and we're trying to move to a more personalised approach to patients. So we didn't realise that actually a lot of our patients who had poor renal function or who were obese were being drastically under or overtreated with vancomycin. So those two high risk categories we changed the dose quite significantly for. And then we found for other patients with good renal function over 90 mL per minute, we also changed the maintenance dose category for those. And we uncovered that from the baseline audit, which I mentioned at the beginning. So that was the dosing intervention, and that was based on using expert opinion from our clinicians and pharmacy expertise, and then also looking at the primary literature and what other trusts have done. And there's actually an evidence gap there, which we're now looking into a research aspect, but that was how we developed the best practice for that at the time. We also found there's a really useful systematic review, which was another thing identified from literature search for that. Very quickly, secondly, protocol accessibility was a big issue. So as I mentioned, we now have that as it's within our EPMA system. It's on a microguide app, and it's on a local Clinical app on the ICU. So and also on our intranet. So it's far more easy to access now. And I think that was a major process change that helped increase compliance.
Lovely, thank you. And Sangeeta's just popped on. Will pharmacogenomics help with this issue going forward?
Absolutely. It's a bit more grey with vancomycin, but with gentamicin, we know that in neonates, there is a genetic predisposition in the kidney that can cause nephrotoxicity. And there's actually some centres are screening for patients before they give gentamicin now, just to identify those high-risk patients and offer an alternative dosing strategy or a different treatment. I think with genomics, with these kind of drugs that don't have, so vancomycin doesn't have as specific metabolism things with the liver, which is like, CYP mediated metabolism. That's where a lot of the genomics things of medicines come in. So things like clopidogrel is a really good way to identify patients who can metabolize it and actively use it and patients who can't. I think with vancomycin, it's looking at patients who are more likely to have kidney injury from the drug. And there are a couple of biomarkers, but they're not well explored at the moment. But I think within the future, genomics is a great risk stratifier for identifying more high-risk patients who are more likely to have side effects from these medications. And I think that's a work in progress, which we're also looking to research into.
Lovely, that's brilliant. Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you so much to Hester, and thank you so much to Robert. They're really, really valuable presentations. The slide packs and recordings will be available post-event. We'll make sure that those are up on HQIP's website and NQICAN. I think it's potentially time. I know we just flashed to another slide there, Sonia, but actually, could we move on to the Menti? Would that be okay before we set the scene for sending you off with some challenges from today's Lunch and Learn? So I'm going to hand over to Layla, who's our London chair, as I explained before, just to run our interactive evaluation.
Hello everyone, I'm hoping you can see my screen, and this is the Menti code and site and the QR code. So if you use that with your phones, you should be able to go into the system. I'll give everyone a chance to do that. Okay, I've got some thumbs coming up, which is fantastic. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity, and it will work, to feedback. So it should allow you to start to feed in this information, and as you put it in, these bars should move. So let's see. Fantastic. Now, that's great. Keep going, please, everyone, because I know that there are a lot of people on the call, and as you can see, it's all moving. Which is pretty fantastic to see. So thank you for that. I'm going to leave it 30 more seconds for any more feedback. Okay. Fantastic. So they seem to, well, one moved just at that second where I thought they'd stayed still. So this is the feedback. That's what we've got so far. Obviously, we're going to share this at the end as well, but it's roughly on par. And now the next questions, but this will still collect if you didn't get a chance to represent your view. The next slide, which will come up, is what is it that what's your takeaway from today's session? So it's inviting you to write in your takeaway. And again, as they come up, actually, I'm wondering if the takeaway will come up in here. Yes, they are. So yes, we must link audit with patient safety and quality improvement. That's a must, and your teams working on PSERF will no doubt have started very avid conversations with you about this, as they have in my own trust. Engage patients, absolutely. That's been on the agenda for a long time, but I think we still all have work to do there. Being part of PSERF, yep. Audit and safety strategies together, working together. To process map stakeholder engagement and MDT engagement, absolutely. Audit is quality improvement, I couldn't agree more. Advocating the benefits to all stakeholders to help buy-in, absolutely. I agree, PSERF is a real opportunity for trusts and hopefully an opportunity for audit teams to really be seen as valued and playing a role. I think it's going to be a very exciting year and a new landscape for us all. Yep, everyone is. So there's a need. So if you haven't connected, please go and talk to your patient safety team. And I think we're going to really see trusts embracing audit and what it can do on this journey and improving the patient pathway. And no doubt, my hope is it will go full circle to 10 years ago when audit was seen as a very valued tool of improving patient pathways and seeing what was going on. So thank you for those. I got 36 answers to that, so that's fantastic. Victoria, do you want to jump in with anything?
No, I think it's brilliant to see this feedback coming through. This and everything that was in the chat is absolutely fantastic. Yeah, we've all got work to do, and I think, yeah, if we encourage you to do a couple of things from today, is to really go and knock on the door of your patient safety team, find out how the PSERF's being implemented in your organisation and how you can start to collaborate and work together to make sure that we're utilising clinical audit to prevent that avoidable harm. I think that's the key thing. We've got patients at the heart of everything that we're doing every day. So yeah, that's brilliant. It's really good, useful feedback. The mentees will go onto the websites alongside the slide packs and recordings as well, so you'll all get access to this feedback that we've just collated through the mentees. So thank you so much for that, Layla. Thank you to Hester, thank you to Robert, thank you to Sonia, who's behind the scenes trying to keep us just going with the tech on today's session. Please do, if you've got time tomorrow, to join us at 12:30 for our Lunch on Learn on patient and public involvement, where we'll hear from Bren McGowan, who's the Head of Policy at Healthwatch, and then obviously we'll continue with with the lunch and learns as we go through the week. So we hope you have a fantastic afternoon, fantastic rest of the week as Clinical Audit Awareness Week, and do keep sharing what you're managing to do in your own organisations and achieve as well. And thank you for joining us today. So take care and have a lovely afternoon.